Political analyst James M. Dorsey is joining us now from Singapore to discuss the first anniversary since the Israeli incursion into Gaza has started. Good to see you, James.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Now, how has the conflict in Gaza reshaped the infrastructure of the region over the past year?
Well, what it's done is, first of all, it's destroyed infrastructure. We're seeing that both in Gaza and in Lebanon, and to a degree on the West Bank. It's fundamentally rewritten the political infrastructure. And what that means, we still have to wait and see. Clearly, what it means is a very difficult period going forward for the Palestinians, a probably difficult period, although perhaps less difficult, one has to wait and see, for the Lebanese. And then, of course, there is the great unknown, which is how the conflict between Israel and Iran will unfold.
Now, what are the mental health implications for survivors in Gaza, particularly children who have been living under bombardment and siege?
You're going to see a population that is traumatized. Now, to be fair, there's trauma on the other side of the border, too. I would argue that the trauma is that Palestinians are experiencing as a result of the last year is worse than what the Israelis are experiencing, but that is not to discount the Israeli experience, which basically means trauma is psychological. You're going to get mental issues. You're going to get behavioral issues. You're going to get the issues of education loss. So, I mean, this is going to be addressing these issues is a monumental task, no less monumental than the physical reconstruction of Gaza.
Why has the international community been unable to stop or intervene in what some are calling genocide in Gaza?
Well, frankly, there's not much. It's clear what the international community thinks, by and large, but there's not much that the international community can do. It doesn't really have the instruments to do that. The one power that, in theory at least, has influence, particularly on Israel, is, of course, the United States. Now, that's not to say that there are not shades of gray in the positions of the United States and Israel, but the United States has not been willing so far to put its money where its mouth is in terms of its criticisms of the way that Israel conducts the war, and is unlikely to do this in the next month or two in advance of the U.S. presidential election.
In what ways has the Israeli incursion into Lebanon escalated tensions in the wider Middle East, and what are the potential risks of further regional conflict?
Well, I think we've got to keep one thing in mind. If the Gaza conflict and Hamas's October 7 attack last year and a year ago from today was the product of Israeli policy and the Israeli occupation over 6 years, refusal to recognize Palestinian rights, the conflict in Lebanon, this particular conflict, was initiated by Hezbollah. It chose for its own political reasons to launch hostilities. And that's going to be a very significant difference. Essentially, what it has done is it's put Iran in a bind. I think that Iran was, on the one hand, happy to see Hezbollah, in a very contained and restrained manner, act against Israel. But on the other hand, it was concerned that that could spin out of control, like we're seeing now, and force Iran's hand and drag it into a conflict. It's, in my view, what we saw last week with the Iranian missile barrage was essentially Iran trying to act in a constrained manner, with other words, ensure that there were not civilian casualties in Israel, but at the same time try and restore its credibility, which was being damaged among the in the axis of resistance groups because Iran was not acting. And you saw that also in segments of the Lebanese Shiite popular base of Hezbollah, who felt that Iran had abandoned them.
Now, what role do humanitarian organizations play in Gaza and Lebanon, and what are the biggest obstacles they face in delivering aid?
The biggest obstacle is clearly access, which the Israelis are complicating and have been doing throughout this war. Uh, once you get the once you can act on the with Israeli assistance rather than with Israeli resistance, then of course you're going to see a massive inflow of humanitarian aid, and in many ways, contrary to reconstruction of Gaza, there'll be a greater willingness to fund the the humanitarian aid and the influx of all the sort of goods, food, medical supplies, and so on that Gaza badly needs.
How does the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon impact broader geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East, and what diplomatic efforts are currently in play?
Well, they're not. I mean, there's lots of talk and little, or if you wish, lots of motion and little movement. With other words, there are no real moves to resolve the issue because neither side really wants a ceasefire. To be fair, certainly not in Lebanon at this point. What this does to the geopolitics, that's the $64,000 question. I think at this moment, Israel's in the driver's seat. In other words, how it responds to the Iranian missile barrage, whether it responds in a more performative fashion, a more symbolic fashion, without provoking a harsh tit for tat that then spins out of control. That's what's going to determine what the geopolitics is going to look like. If indeed you get an armed conflict between Iran and Israel, I think you've got to keep in mind that Israel is probably the militarily stronger party. Because of sanctions, Iran does not have an air force worth mentioning. It doesn't have a navy worth mentioning. The two countries don't have ground borders. And so Iran's going to have to rely on its ballistic missile program, as well as its non-state allies. And that's a comparatively weaker position than Israel is in.
To wrap it all up, what can we expect in the next year?
I think, well, the key question here is how quickly do you get the guns to fall silent? Without the guns falling silent, nothing much happens. That's most likely not to happen until after the US election, and maybe not even until you get the transition to the new US administration in late January of next year. Depending on who is in office in the White House at that point, and of course of how the hostilities develop in the meantime, that's going to determine what the next year in the Middle East is going to look like.
James M. Dorsey, thank you for joining NewsHour, and thank you for your analysis.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.